Welcome to Revenge and Justice, where betrayal finally meets its reckoning. We share powerful first-person stories of men who were underestimated, betrayed, and pushed too far by family business partners and the people they trusted most. If you believe respect must be earned and betrayal always has a price, you've found your home. And now, today's story.
That was the only sentence I ever cared to have said about me, and I had never once said it out loud to another living person. On the evening of October 24th, I put on a clean shirt and drove down to the harbor to watch them open my daughter's bridge. I am going to walk you through that evening the way it happened, in order, because everything that came afterward turns on about 9 seconds of it. The Kestrel Point Bridge crosses the mouth of the St. Louis River, where it opens into the harbor. And that night the wind was coming off Lake Superior the way it does in late October, low and steady and carrying the smell of cold iron. They had strung lights along both cables. From the far bank, it looked like somebody had laid a necklace across the water. I parked my truck 4 blocks out in the gravel lot behind a shuttered net house because a 1978 Chevy sitting in a valet line embarrasses everybody involved. I had cleaned it that morning anyway. Habit. I wore the gray jacket my wife bought me in 1991, and I had shined my boots at the kitchen table with the good polish, the kind in the flat tin you have to warm up in your hand first. I walked up the approach ramp because I wanted to see the deck before the speeches started. Halfway along, I put 2 fingers on the pipe railing and gave it a knock, the way I have knocked on every piece of steel I have passed for half a century. It is not a decision. It is closer to breathing. The railing answered wrong. I remember standing there maybe 3 seconds. Then a woman in heels came clicking past me, talking about parking, and a photographer asked me to step left, and I stepped left, and I let it go. A railing is not a bridge. A railing is decoration. That is what I told myself, and I have had a long time since then to think about how easy it was to tell myself that. There were 900 people on the deck and under the tent at the north abutment. The governor was there. 3 television vans had their masts up. Somewhere a jazz quartet was playing the kind of music that exists so that nobody has to hear a silence. Marie Rogers found me before I had gotten 20 feet in. She is my daughter's mother-in-law, and she has a way of arriving beside you that makes it feel like you were the one who went looking for her. She took both my hands. She said how wonderful it was that I could come. Then she walked me, still holding one hand, to a table at the very end of the last row, next to the gap in the tent where the catering staff came in and out with the crates. She said the sightlines were better from there. She said it twice, in 2 different ways, and both ways were kind, and neither one was true. I sat down. The chair had one leg on the seam of the temporary flooring, so it rocked. I put my hand flat on the table to steady it, and I looked at the bronze plaque they had bolted to the pier face, lit from below by 2 ground lights. It said the bridge was dedicated to the vision and the civic generosity of the Birch family. The letters were a 1/4 inch proud of the plate. Somebody had paid extra for that. Then my daughter came up onto the platform, and I forgot the chair and the tent and the plaque. Briar had her mother's hands. She was holding the folder they give you with the ceremonial remarks in it, and she was holding it the way you hold something you do not intend to read from. And when the lights came up on her, she did not blink. 29 years old, and her name on the structural drawings of a river crossing. I sat in the last row, with my boots polished, and something climbed up into my throat and stopped there, and I did not say a word to anybody. Because I have never once in my life been able to get that particular thing out of my mouth. There is one more piece you should know, and I will say it here and then leave it alone for a while. 11 months before that evening, a steel erection company out of Duluth submitted a bid to fabricate and set the main span of the Kestrel Point Bridge. That bid was rejected. The letter said the pricing came in 14% above the selected fabricator and could not be justified to the funding partners. I read that letter at my kitchen table. I owned the company that wrote it. Nobody at that ceremony knew that, including my daughter, and that was a thing I had chosen on purpose years earlier for reasons I still believe were good ones. Maximo Birch took the microphone at 6:20. He is 66, and he speaks the way men speak when they have never in their adult life been interrupted. He talked about the river. He talked about the working people of this city, and he said that phrase, the working people of this city, 4 separate times. And each time he said it, he made a small opening gesture with one hand, as though he were setting a plate of something down in front of us. When the applause started, the photographers moved in toward the platform for the family picture. I got up. That is all I did. I wanted to be in one photograph with my daughter on the night her bridge opened, and so I walked up the center aisle toward the platform, and my route took me past the roped section at the pier face, where the memorial pad had been poured that afternoon and was still curing under a tarp. I did not see him turn. I felt the hand between my shoulder blades. It was not a slap, and it was not a shove from the shoulder. It was a straight push, low on the back, with the weight behind it, the kind of push a man gives a door he expects to swing. I went off the edge of the flooring and down onto the pad, forward arms out, and the wet concrete came up and took my forearms to the elbow, and my chest, and the left side of my face. The quartet stopped. Not all at once. The horn stopped, and then the bass took 2 more notes to understand, and then nothing. I got my hands under me. Concrete does not feel like mud. It is heavier, and it is colder, and it holds on. I could hear it letting go of my jacket in strings as I pushed up onto my knees, and I could hear 900 people not talking. Maximo Birch was standing above me at the rope with a linen napkin in his hand. He was already wiping. He wiped the palm that had been on my back, and then he wiped between the fingers, one at a time, unhurried, the way you would after handling something that had been dead a while. Then he turned back to the microphone, which was still live, and said that the pier area was reserved for invited guests, and he said it in the same warm voice he had used for the working people of this city. I stood up. Concrete was running off my chin. I found my daughter on the platform, and she found me, and for 1 second, 1 full second, our eyes held. Then she looked down at the folder in her hands. I have carried steel loads over open water in a January wind. I have identified a man for his mother. Nothing in my life has ever gone through me like the top of my daughter's head. I did not say anything. I turned around and I walked back down the center aisle and out through the gap in the tent where the catering crates came in. And behind me, after about 4 steps, the quartet picked up the same tune from the top, and 900 people started talking again. I had spent 47 years making sure no bridge of mine ever came down. What I did not know, walking across that gravel lot with wet concrete stiffening on my sleeves, was that I had just been standing on one that was going to. I had the key in the door of the truck when headlights swung across the gravel behind me and stopped. He came at a jog and he had no coat on. That was the first thing I noticed. 38 degrees coming off the lake, and my son-in-law had left his coat inside so that he would arrive with his shirt sleeves flat against his arms in the wind. And I want to be fair here. I do not know that he thought it through. Some men do that, the way other men breathe. Princeton Pittman is 34. He has the kind of face that photographs well from either side, and he uses his hands when he talks low and open near his own chest, so that whatever he is saying seems to be coming out of the middle of him. He said my name. He said he was sick about it. He said his father had started a new blood pressure medication in September, and that the doctor had been clear about alcohol, and that Maximo had been on his feet since 5 in the morning with the governor's people, and that none of that made it right. None of it. But that I should know it was not the man, it was the circumstances. He talked for a while. I let him. I have sat across a table from men who wanted a change order signed, and I know what it sounds like when somebody is laying track in front of a train. Then he got to it. He said, and here his voice came down, that Breyer had been building toward this night for 1.5 years, that there were 3 television cameras still up, that if this became a story, it would not become a story about his father, it would become a story about her on the night her bridge opened, and it would follow her. He asked me to let it go. For her. I stood there with concrete drying on my forearms, and I looked at him. He had run 100 yards across a gravel lot in the cold, and his breathing was completely even. Not one word of it had cost him anything. He offered to replace the jacket. He said the name of a place downtown. I told him the jacket was fine. He said he would call me in the morning, and he stepped back, and as he stepped back, he reached out and took hold of the side mirror on my truck and turned it a 1/4 inch, straightening it without looking at it, the way you would square a picture frame in somebody else's house. Then he jogged back toward the lights. I got in the cab and sat there with my hands on the wheel and did not start the engine. Here is the part I have not told you yet, and I am going to tell it plain and then set it down. In 1974, I bought a used flatbed and a welding rig with $4,000, and I called it Everett Steel Erectors because I could not think of anything better and the sign painter needed an answer. For the first 2 years, it was me and one man named Rory Bowman and whatever we could get. We set stair towers. We did rework. Nobody else wanted the jobs where somebody had already been out there once and gotten it wrong. It is not that anymore. Today, the company erects structural steel in 14 states, stadiums, river crossings, the kind of towers where the crane sits inside the building and climbs with it. I hold it through a trust, and the trust is the sole owner. And the last time anyone made me look at the number, it was a little over $1.9 billion. And I remember thinking that the number had stopped meaning anything to me around the time it got to be more than I could picture as a stack of something. Nobody at that ceremony knew. There is no name on any building. There has not been an interview. When the company needs a face, a man named Dale from the board flies out and does it, and Dale is very good at it. And Dale has never once had to explain to anybody who the actual owner is, because nobody has ever thought to ask. I want to be honest about how that arrangement worked because it matters later. Somewhere around 2014, I stopped reading the quarterly reports. I did not announce it. The board is 9 people, all of them better educated than me, and they were doing well, and every time I read one of those reports, I found myself wanting to reach into it and move something. So I quit reading them. I told myself it was trust. What it actually was a way to not have to decide anything. And my daughter did not know either. When Briar was 20, she was in her 2nd year of engineering, and she came home over Christmas, and we were doing dishes, and out of nowhere she said, "I want to know if I can do it by myself." She did not say it angry. She said it the way you say a thing you have already thought about for a long time in a room with the door shut. She said, "If you ever pull a string for me, I want you to tell me." And I said, "All right." And she said, "No, promise me." And I dried my hands on the towel, and I promised her. So she went out and got hired on her own, and she took her licensing exams on her own. And every year she got a little further out onto ice that I was not allowed to stand on. There were maybe 6 times I could have made a phone call. I did not make them. That promise is the only thing in my life I have kept the way I keep a weld log. It is a strange feeling, sitting in a cold truck at 71 years old, to understand that the biggest thing you have ever built is the thing your own child would be most insulted to find out about. I started the engine. The route home from the harbor takes you back along the frontage road and then under the north approach of the bridge, where the road dips and the deck goes over you, and for about 90 feet, the sky is steel. I do not know why I stopped. I have gone under 1,000 bridges. But I pulled onto the shoulder with the engine running, and I got out and stood in the wash of my own headlights, and up over my head, close enough to touch if I stood on the bumper, was the underside of the main girder line. The lights they had strung for the party were all up on top. Down there it was just gray metal and bolt heads, and the smell of the river. I stepped up on the bumper. I put my hand flat on the bottom flange, the way you do to feel whether it is warmer or colder than the air, and then I made a fist, and I knocked on it twice with the second knuckle. I have knocked on steel for 47 years. Good plate answers you once and quits. This answered, and then it kept answering, long and thin, going out and out into the dark over the water, and it did not want to stop. I stood on the bumper of my truck in the cold with my hand still on the flange of that girder, and I listened to a sound I had heard exactly one other time in my life.
in October of 1979. I do not remember driving home. I remember getting down off the bumper, and I remember the porch light at the house on Commonwealth Avenue, and nothing in between. The garage is behind the house, 20 by 30, built in 1958 by a man who framed it out of green lumber, so the whole thing has a slight lean to the north that I have stopped noticing. My bench runs along the back wall. There is a vise on it that belonged to my father. There is a stove I put in myself, and I did not light it that night. I sat down on the stool in the gray jacket with the concrete dried to it in plates, and I reached into the breast pocket and took out a rivet. It is a 3/4-inch button head, about 2 inches long, cold now, for 47 years. In the fall of 1974, I was on a rehab job in Superior, where they still had a rivet crew, working 4 old men and a coal forge, the last one anybody in this part of the country ever put on a job. I was the youngest man on that deck by 20 years. The heater tossed one to the catcher, and the catcher bobbled it, and it went down through the grating, and I picked it up out of the dirt at the end of the shift. I never drove it. I have carried it in my shirt pocket ever since, and when people notice, they think it is a good luck piece, and I let them think that. It is not a good luck piece. It is a bill. In October of 1979, I was 24 years old, and I had been made a pusher 3 weeks earlier, which means I was the man who told other men where to be and when. We were setting the head house framing on a grain terminal across the bay. The whole job was 11 days behind because of a barge that did not come, and the general contractor had a man on site whose entire function was to stand at the bottom of the ladder and ask what time we would top out. I had a kid on my crew named Noah Moses. He was 19. He had been married 5 weeks. He was a connector, which is the job you give to somebody young and fearless, because a connector walks the iron out ahead of everybody and puts in the first 2 bolts that hold a piece in the air. Noah had a habit. When he set a bolt, he would run it up and then give the wrench one more quarter turn past where it wanted to stop, and he would say, "That one is for my mother." Every bolt, 50 times a day. The other men made fun of him for it, and he did not care. On the 10th of October, we were hanging a transfer beam at the 3rd level. The piece came up, and the fit-up was wrong. There was a gap at the connection, maybe an 1/8. And when I put my light on it, I could see that somebody in the shop had burned the holes out with a torch instead of drilling them, and then filled the difference back in with weld. I knocked on it. I want to be very clear about this because I have had 42 years to be clear about it. I put my knuckle on that plate, and it answered me long. It went out, and it did not want to quit. I have described that sound to you already, and you know now that I know it. And then a man at the bottom of a ladder asked me what time we would top out. I told myself the gap was within tolerance. I told myself the shop had a certificate on the wall, and I did not. I told myself that if I stopped that pick, we would lose the crane for a day and a half, and that 11 days behind would become 13, and that 13 days behind was the kind of number that ends a company that has 2 trucks. All of that was true. Every single thing I told myself that night was true, and I have never once been able to use that as a comfort. I said, "Run it." The next morning at 6:40 in the dark, with the lights still on, that connection let go while Noah Moses was standing on it. People think there is a sound. There is not much of one. There is the piece, which is loud, and then there is a period of time that I could not measure then and cannot measure now, and then there is men shouting from 3 different levels who cannot see each other. I was the first one down. I want to say that plainly because it is the only part of it I have ever been able to hold on to. I got to him in the mud under the transfer tower, and he was on his side, and he still had the wrench in his hand. His fingers were closed on it. I could not open them. I tried for a while, and I could not, and then somebody put a coat over him and pulled me off by the shoulders. 3 days later, a woman came into the office trailer, and I stood up and I told her who I was and what her son had been doing on that deck, and she asked me if he was good at it. I said he was the best young connector I ever had. That was true. I did not tell her about the knock. I have not told anybody about the knock except one man,
and Rory Bowman has never, in 42 years, brought it up. I sat in the garage that night with the rivet in my hand, and I turned around on the stool, and I knocked twice on the jaw of my father's vise. It came back short. One sound, and done. The way it is supposed to. The stove was still cold, and I could see my own breath in there. A plate of concrete let go off my sleeve and hit the floor and broke apart into 3 pieces. I sat and looked at them. A man can spend 47 years building things so that he never has to hear that sound again, and then hear it anyway, from underneath on a Wednesday night in October, with his own daughter's name on the drawings. Then I put the rivet back in my pocket, and I looked at the clock on the wall, and it said 7 minutes after 3, and I got out my phone. Niklaus Weiss has been my attorney for 26 years. He is 57, he is never married, and he does not answer a cell phone after midnight on the theory that anything worth calling about at that hour is worth being at your desk for. So I called the office line. It rang 4 times. He said my name, not hello. I told him I needed to look at the Kestrel Point job. Everything. The fabricator of record, the mill certifications, the material test reports, every change order, and the ownership of every entity in the chain, from the pier caps up. He asked me over what period. I said since the bid, and while he was in there I wanted the same look at Birch Capital Partners. Who they owe, who owes them, what they have pledged, and to whom. Then I told him the part that mattered. No letters of inquiry, no formal requests, nothing on my letterhead or anybody's. If a single person at that company gets a phone call from an office they do not recognize, we are finished before we start. There was a pause on the line. I could hear him writing. Niklaus asked me what exactly he was looking for. He asked it carefully, the way a man does when he is trying to find out whether his client has had a bad night or has actually found something. I said I suspect the bridge. Duffy's opens at 4:30 in the morning for the ore boat cruise, and at 5:02 I heard the cane. It is aluminum, and it has a rubber tip that has gone hard, so it does not thump, it clicks, and you can hear him coming from the door. Rory Bowman is 73. He had both hips done, and only one of them took. He came down the aisle between the counter and the booths at the speed he goes now, which is about 1/3 of what it used to be, and he sat down across from me and looked at my face for a while. He said, "Cisco." He has called me that since 1975, and he is the last man alive who does. He did not say anything about the ceremony. He had heard. In this town, everybody had heard by 10 o'clock the night before. He looked at the scrape along my cheekbone, and then he picked up the menu he has not read since the Carter administration, and he said that the eggs here had gone downhill. Then he asked how my hand was, because I had it lying flat on the table, and I had not noticed I was doing that. He has been reading me across tables since we were both young enough to eat like that and go straight up a ladder afterward. I turned my coffee cup around and told him it was fine. I asked him about his grandson. Wade Bowman is 26, and he had been working night shift on the Kestrel Point job since spring, running a bolt gang on the deck steel. Rory had told me about it back in April, with the particular pride of a man watching a 3rd generation get up on the iron. Rory put the menu down. He said Wade quit in August. Not at the end of a shift. In the middle of one, at about 2 in the morning, he came down off the deck, put his gear in his truck, and drove home. He never went back for his last check. When his mother asked him about it, he said he had a better offer. And when Rory asked him about it, sitting in the driveway, out of everybody's hearing, Wade said something different. He said, "I do not want my name on it." That was all he would say. Rory pushed him twice and got nothing, and he let it go, because you do let things go when a young man does not want to talk. He said he had thought about that sentence maybe 100 times since August, and had never once been able to make it mean anything ordinary. I asked him where the job was putting its cutoff. He knew what I meant, which is why I asked him instead of somebody else. When you fabricate and set structural steel, there is always waste. Trim ends, coping, drops the piece you cut out of a web to make room for a brace. It goes into a bin, and the bin goes to a yard, and the yard weighs it and pays somebody by the ton, and nobody on this earth thinks about it again. Rory said the drops from Kestrel Point were going to a private laydown on Rice's Point that the contractor was renting because scrap prices were down and they were holding it to sell in the spring. We took my truck. Rice's Point in late October at 6 in the morning is one of the emptiest places in North America. Fog off the slip gulls the ore dock standing out in the water like something left over from another civilization. The yard is gravel and mud with a chain gate, and the gate was open because the yard man, whose name is Emmett, has known Rory since before either of them had gray in them, and Emmett did not ask us one question. He raised his coffee at us through the window of the shed and went back to his radio. The pile was about the size of a boxcar. Two old men, one of them with a cane, going through a scrap pile in the cold. I would like to tell you it was more dignified than it was. Rory could not bend, so he stood at the edge and turned pieces over with the cane and told me which ones to look at, and I did the going down on my knees. The frost had welded some of it together, and you had to break it loose. Twice I put my hand on an edge that had been flame cut and not ground, and both times I bled a little, and it was so cold I did not notice until later. It took us about 40 minutes to find it. It was a piece of web plate, maybe 18 inches by 2 feet, with a bolt hole pattern along one edge where it had been coped out to fit a stiffener. It was the drop from a main girder. It had the paint on it, the gray they had used on the whole bridge. I stood it up on end against the pile, and I hit it with my knuckle. It rang thin. It rang the way the railing had rung on the approach ramp, and the way the bottom flange had rung under my headlights, and the way one bad connection had rung in October of 1979 at the third level of a grain terminal. I had a dial caliper in the glove box. I have carried one for 50 years, the way other men carry a pocket knife. I went and got it, and I came back, and I measured that plate in 4 places. The drawings for that girder line call for a web thickness of 5/8 of an inch. The first measurement came in at just under 9/16. So did the second. The fourth one at the corner was worse. That is not a rolling tolerance. That is a different piece of steel than the one anybody ordered, and it was carrying a river crossing that the governor of this state had walked across 11 hours earlier. I stayed down on one knee in the gravel with the caliper in my hand longer than I needed to. Rory said from behind me, "Quiet, the way you talk in a hospital corridor." "Cisco, that is the same sound." He had never said it. 42 years, 400 job sites, 2 funerals, and the man had never once said a word to me about the 10th of October, 1979. He said it that morning in a scrapyard, with fog coming off the slip, and he did not say anything after it. And he did not need to. I did not answer him. I have thought since that this was not fair to him. A gull came down onto the pile about 10 feet from us and stood there looking at the two of us with the flat interest gulls have, and then lifted off again. Somewhere out in the fog, the conveyor on the ore dock started up, ran for maybe 8 seconds, and shut off. I put my head down, and I went back to the plate. Every piece of structural steel that leaves a mill carries a mark. Producer-grade heat number. It gets stenciled or stamped, and it follows the material through fabrication, so that if anybody ever asks a question in a courtroom, the answer exists. The mark on that plate was on the underside, near the coped corner, and somebody had taken a grinder to it. Not all the way. Whoever did it was in a hurry, or was working in bad light, or did not care very much because they had taken the heat number off clean and then run out of patience. Half the producer stamp was still there. I wiped the frost off it with my thumb and turned the plate toward what light there was. It was not the fabricator of record. It was not any mill I had bought a pound of steel from in 47 years, and I have bought from all of them. The letter said, Halberd. I was still in the garage at 7 the next morning, in the same clothes, with the piece of web plate up on the bench where the light was good, when Nicklaus called. I have heard that man's voice under a lot of conditions, including across a table from federal regulators. It does not change. It changed that morning. He had not been to bed, and there was something in it I had to listen to twice before I understood what it was. And what it was that he had gotten out ahead of me and did not like where he had come out. He said Halberd Metals is not a mill. It was organized 22 months ago. It has a registered agent in Wilmington, Delaware, a foreign registration in Minnesota, a mailing address that is a suite number in a building on Superior Street that rents mailboxes, and no property, no plant, no furnace, no rolling line, and no employees on any payroll filing anywhere in the United States. What it has is a purchasing history. Nicklaus walked me through it the way he does slow and order, so that I would arrive at the conclusion myself instead of having it handed to me. Halberd buys secondary and surplus plate on the international broker market, off-spec material. Milliseconds out-of-tolerance rolls product that failed somebody else's acceptance. It is legitimate steel, and there is a legitimate trade in it for tank bottoms and equipment skids and 40 other places where nobody's life is sitting on top of it. Halberd buys it at secondary price. Then it generates a certification package. Then it sells it into a project at domestic prime price, as if it had come off a mill in Indiana with a test report behind it. I asked him who organized the company. He said the operating agreement was signed by a manager of record, and the manager of record listed on the initial filing and on all 3 amendments since is Princeton Pittman. I stood in my garage and looked at a piece of gray-painted plate that was 1/16 of an inch too thin, and I did not say anything for long enough that Nicklaus said my name. There is a thing that happens when you hear a name in a place where it has no business being. It is not surprise. Surprise is fast, and this is slow. It is closer to the feeling of putting your weight on a stair tread in your own house and having it move under you. I looked at the plate on the bench. I thought about a young man in shirt sleeves jogging 100 yards across a gravel lot in the cold with his breathing completely even. Then he said the part I need you to hold on to, because it comes back later, and it comes back hard. He said the manager is Princeton, but the ownership above the manager runs through a nominee arrangement, one of those agent of record setups, where the human being who actually holds the membership interest is behind a service company. He said he could get through it, but not by morning, and probably not by the end of the week, without asking somebody a question that would get back to them. I told him to leave it. We had bigger things in front of us. I have thought about that decision many times since. Then he gave me Birch Capital Partners. The picture was not complicated. It almost never is with that kind of money. Birch Capital has not produced a real return in 4 years. They took a bad position in a resort development on the North Shore in the second half of 2019, and instead of taking the loss, they papered over it and went looking for something to fill the hole. The house on Congdon Boulevard carries a mortgage that was written 18 months ago. 2 of the cars are leased through the firm. The art on the walls of their offices is on consignment. Every single thing about that family that a person can see from the outside is rented. When conventional lenders stopped, they went to private credit. The paper is held by a fund run by a man named Camilo Stone. Stone is 55, he is very polite, he wears good coats, and he lends money to people no bank will touch, at rates no bank could charge. There is nothing illegal about it. There is also nothing forgiving about it. Birch Capital owes that fund $26 million, and the note comes due on the 31st of December. I asked Nicklaus for one more number. I asked him what the material substitution on the Kestrel Point job was worth. Not the contract value, the spread. The difference between what Halberd paid for that steel on the secondary market and what it billed the project at Prime. He had already run it. He said with the tonnage on that structure between $3.5 and $4 million. I sat down on the stool. $3.5 million against $26 million due in 9 weeks. It is not close. It is not even the same order of thing. You do not put a river crossing and a state highway department and your own name on a bronze plaque at risk for a number that covers 13% of what you owe. A man who is drowning does not commit a felony to get himself a cup of water. I said it out loud to Nicklaus, and I said it slowly because I was working it out as it came. The steel does not pay the debt. He was quiet on the line. Then he said no, it does not, which meant the steel was not the point. The steel was something they did along the way because they were already inside the job and it was there to take.
The actual thing, the thing worth $26 million, the thing worth doing all of this for, was still somewhere in that project. And I was looking straight at the project, and I could not see it. I sat there and went through that job the way you go through any job. There is the contract value. There is the land at both approaches. There is the 20-year maintenance agreement. There is the performance bond. I went through all of it twice, and none of it came anywhere close to $26 million. And not one piece of it explained why a man would need to marry into a family in order to reach it. Nicklaus is a practical man, and he did what practical men do with a problem that has no visible shape. He proposed a solution to a different problem. He said, buy the paper. He laid it out in about 90 seconds. Approach Stone through an intermediary, offer him a premium over face for a note he privately doubts he will collect on. Take the assignment, and by the middle of November, we would hold every marker the Birch family has: their house, their firm, their leases. He said they will do whatever we tell them to do, and nobody will ever know it was us. I told him to price it and not to move on it yet. Then I asked him for the project schedule. I wanted the load test. Every new bridge in this state goes through a controlled load test before it opens to unrestricted traffic, and I wanted to know how long I had before somebody put real weight on that structure. In my head, I was working with the 2nd of November, because that was the date on the invitation my daughter had mailed me in September. There was a pause. Paper. Nicklaus said the ribbon ceremony had been moved. It was no longer the 2nd. The department had it as the morning of the 1st of November at 9, with the governor's office confirmed, and the reason given in the correspondence was scheduling. And the load test, he said, was that same afternoon. 12 loaded triaxle ore trucks staged and running the deck at 2 o'clock. I looked at the clock on the garage wall. I had thought I had 9 days. I had 7.5. The address Nicklaus gave me was a rented lot outside Cloquet, 22 miles southwest, in a stand of jack pine off a county road with no shoulder. There was a single-wide trailer on it, white going to gray, with a stovepipe and a wood pile that had been stacked by somebody who knew how. There was a chain staked in the dirt by the step, with a swivel clip on the end of it, and no dog on the other end, and no dog anywhere. And the ground all around that stake had grown back over. I knocked. The door opened 4 inches on a chain. The man behind it was 62, and looked older, the way men look when they have lost weight they did not have to lose. He looked at my truck first, then at my boots. Then he said, whatever they are paying you, it is not enough, and go away. I said I did not work for the Birches. He said that is what the last one said too, and he shut the door. I stood out there in the cold for a while. There is a thing you learn in this trade, which is that a man who is finished talking to you is often only finished talking to you for a minute. And the wrong move is to knock again. So I did not knock. I said loud enough to go through a trailer wall that the web plate on the north girder line at Kestrel Point measures 9/16, that the drawings call for 5/8, that I had put a caliper on it in 4 places that morning, and that half the producer stamp had been taken off with a grinder. Nothing happened for maybe 15 seconds. Then the chain came off, and the door opened all the way, and Uriel Cook stood in it, in a flannel shirt and sock feet, and he did not invite me in. He looked at my hands. That is what he looked at. Not my face, my hands, the backs of them, and then the palms when I turned them over, the way one tradesman reads another. I put my hand out. He looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that I had time to think about pulling it back. Then he took it. His hand was cold, and it was strong, and it went on longer than a handshake goes on, and neither of us said anything about that. And he stepped aside and let me in. I did business for 20 years on a handshake. Steel went up in the air on it. Men got paid on it. Somewhere along the way, that stopped being how anything worked, and all of it moved on to paper, and a signature became the only thing anybody would take as a promise. I never did get used to that. I do not think he ever did either. The inside was kerosene and old paper. There was a cot, a 2-burner, a card table with a lamp. On the shelf above the cot, in its case laid flat and closed, was a vernier and ultrasonic thickness gauge kit, the good kind, in a foam-lined box. the kind a man buys once in his life. He had no legal right to use a single instrument in it. He had been an independent structural inspection consultant for 22 years. He worked for owners and lenders, not builders, which meant his entire value was that nobody could tell him what his report said. 3 years ago, he was inspecting a 5-story senior housing structure in Superior, financed by Birch Capital Partners. He found substituted material. He wrote it up as a nonconformance. He would not amend it, and he was asked to amend it 3 times. And the 3rd time, it was not really a request. 5 weeks later, a project manager on that job produced an envelope of cash and a story about where it came from. A complaint went to the state board. There was a hearing. Uriel had no envelope, no story, and no way to prove a negative. And he had one thing said about him by 4 men, who all still needed to work in this town. They pulled his license. He said all of that with no more heat than a man reading a parts list. Then he stopped, and then he told me the rest of it. And the rest of it was that his wife stayed 11 months and then did not. And that the house on 14th went in the spring after that, and that he had come out here because the lot was $90 a month. I asked him if anybody had ever looked into it. He said a reporter had. A woman named Nicole Mahoney at the paper in town. She worked it for 2 months. She had 3 sources, and she had the board transcript. It was written, and it was scheduled. It never ran. He said what he was told secondhand, and a long time after, was that it came down from above the newsroom, and that it had to do with a large advertiser. He never got a name. He said it the way you say a thing you stopped picking at years ago because it had stopped bleeding and started scarring. Then he said, and he said it half to himself, "That is 2 of you this month." I asked him what he meant. He got up and went to the 2-burner and turned on a flame under a kettle that had nothing in it, and turned it off again and stood with his back to me. He said he had given his word to somebody. He said he had very little left that a man could give, and he was going to keep that one. I did not push him. I have wondered since whether I should have. There was a second cup on the drain board. It was washed and turned upside down on a folded towel set apart from his own, the way you keep a thing ready. A man living alone out there does not wash 2 cups unless somebody has sat in that folding chair recently enough to matter. Instead, he went to the cot, got down on his knees, which took him some doing, and pulled a tin box out from under it. It was an old ammunition box with the paint worn through at the corners. Inside was his report. The original nonconformance, 3 years old, with his seal on it, from when the seal still meant something. And behind it, the whole file, the photographs, the field notes, the certified letters. And lying on top of all of it was a manila envelope that was not 3 years old. The clasp was still bright. He handed me that one first. It was a structural safety conformance report for the Kestrel Point River crossing. 40 pages bound at the corner, the kind of document that gets produced at the end of a job so that a highway department can open a bridge to the public. I went to the last page because that is where the certification goes. There was a signature and there was a seal. Minnesota Licensed Professional Engineer, the license number, the name inside the ring in raised letters, Briar Everett. And under the seal in the block where the certifying engineer writes the date in her own hand, it said, the 9th of September. I sat down on a folding chair in a trailer outside Cloquet with that page in my hands. On the 9th of September, I had a cataract taken off my left eye at St. Luke's in Duluth. My daughter drove me there at 5:40 in the morning, and she was in the chair beside my bed when they wheeled me back in. And she was still in it at 4 in the afternoon. And she made me a sandwich in my own kitchen at 7 that night and stayed until 9 because I was not allowed to drive. She never went to the office. She never touched that document. It is 35 minutes back from Cloquet, and I worked it out somewhere around Esco. Uriel Cook had a bound copy of a structural conformance report for a job he has no legal standing to touch. That document does not float around. It exists in maybe 9 places: the department, the owner, the contractor, the design firm of record, and the desks of the people whose names are on it. A man in a rented trailer does not obtain one by accident. Somebody carried it out there and put it in his hands. Somebody who knew who he was and knew what had been done to him
and believed him anyway. Somebody he would give his word to. Somebody who had sat in that folding chair long enough that he washed a cup afterward and set it apart on a folded towel and kept it ready. That is 2 of you this month. Harvey & Associates has the top 2 floors of a glass building on Superior Street. I got there at 10 minutes to 9 without an appointment, in a clean shirt with the manila envelope in a canvas tool bag because I did not own a briefcase. The lobby is white stone with a ficus in it. I gave my name at the desk and sat down. Bentley Harvey came through the lobby about 4 minutes later, going the other way, with 2 people from the department behind him. He is 51. He has the build of a man who played something in college and has been managing the aftermath ever since. And he smiles before he speaks, always, even when what he is about to say is bad. He saw me. He did not slow down, but his head came around maybe 15 degrees further than it needed to, and he held it there for a step and a half. And then he went on through the doors and out. I did not think much of it at the time. I have thought a great deal about it since. Breyer came down at 9:05. She was glad. That is the thing I want to be accurate about because of what happened later. For about 2 seconds, she was glad, the way she has been glad to see me since she was 4 years old. And then something came down over it like a hand over a candle, and by the time she reached me, she was pleasant. She took me up to her office. It is 9 feet by 11 with a window that looks at another window. On the desk beside her monitor was a hardbound field notebook, the black kind with the red spine, open with a mechanical pencil laid in the gutter. I gave her the first one of those when she was a sophomore, in a Christmas box, with a headlamp and a set of feeler gauges. And she had written on the inside cover of it in a 19-year-old's handwriting that the screen does not know anything. I counted the ones on her shelf while she was pouring coffee. 11. 11 notebooks is 11 years of a woman writing her numbers down by hand because she does not entirely trust a machine to hold them for her. And I had never once told her how much I liked that about her. She asked about my eye. She asked it fast. Then she got out ahead of me, which she has never in her life needed to do, and said she was sorry about the dedication, that Maximo had been under enormous strain, that everyone had been, and that she had called me twice on Saturday and I had not picked up. I had not picked up. That part was true. The way she said the rest of it was not hers. It had somebody else's shape to it. It came out in the right order, and it hit the right points, and it had a place at the end where I was supposed to say it was fine. I said I wanted to ask her about the load numbers. She went very still, not startled, still the way a person goes still when the thing they have been waiting for finally comes. Then she told me. 6 weeks ago, going back through the live load distribution on the north approach spans for the final package, she got a number she did not like. She ran it again. She got it again. She wrote it up and she took it to Bentley Harvey on a Thursday afternoon, and Bentley took it seriously, and the firm engaged an outside reviewer. The outside reviewer reran the model, she said, and here she looked at the window that looks at another window. It turned out I had made an error. She said that sentence the way you say a phone number you have given out 400 times. Every word in the right place, no weight on any of them. I asked her what the error was. She started to answer. She got about 6 words and something about a load case designation, and then she stopped, and she said the reviewer had taken her through it, and it had been clear at the time. I have been on the wrong end of a certificate on a wall. I was 24 years old, and I put my knuckle on a plate, and it told me the truth. And then a man with more paper than me told me a different thing, and I chose the paper. And a 19-year-old boy died holding a wrench. What I was looking at across that desk was a person who had been walked patiently over about 6 weeks to the point where she no longer trusted her own arithmetic. I did not say any of that. I have gone over the reasons, and none of them hold up. Instead, I asked her as evenly as I could whether she had ever met an inspector named Cook. I watched my daughter's face. There is a thing that happens under the skin, at the outside corner of the eye, and it is very small, and I have known that face since it was 11 minutes old. She said the name did not mean anything to her. Then she picked up her coffee, which she had not touched, and drank some of it. So I asked her the last question. I asked whether she had personally applied her seal to the final structural conformance report. There is a length of silence that belongs to a question like that, and it is not very long. It is, however, long it takes a person to hear the words and say yes. She took 3 seconds. Then she said, "Of course I did." Nobody said anything for a moment after that. Somewhere down the hall, a printer ran and stopped. Out the window, across the alley, a woman was watering a plant on a sill with a paper cup. My daughter had both hands flat on the desk on either side of the notebook, and her thumb was moving very slightly against the edge of it, back and forth, the way it used to when she was doing long division at the kitchen table. I told her the eye was healing fine, and I would let her get to work. I could have opened the tool bag. I have had a long time to think about why I did not, and the honest answer is that I did not know yet what she had done and what had been done to her, and there is no way to ask a child that question and ever fully take it back. The parking is 2 levels down under the building. My truck was in the corner by the ramp. Princeton was standing beside it. He had a coffee in one hand, and he was not waiting for me, or he was, and as I came around the concrete pillar, he reached out with his free hand and took hold of the side mirror and turned it a 1/4 inch, straightening it exactly the way he had in a gravel lot 3 nights before. At 10 that night, I had the piece of web plate lying on my kitchen table on a folded towel, with the caliper beside it and the rivet beside that, and a legal pad where I had written down every number I had and drawn a line under the ones I could prove. The phone went off against the wood and her name came up on it. I picked it up and said her name, and she was already talking. She was already past the beginning of it. She had been crying for a while before she dialed, the way you can hear in the back of a person's throat, and she had gotten to the part where the crying has turned into something with edges on it. She said, "You went to my office." She said I had walked into her building without calling in front of the receptionist in front of Bentley and asked her whether she had sealed her own report. She said, "Do you understand what that is?" She said, "That is the one question you never ask an engineer, and you asked it to my face, in my office, with my name on the door." I started to say something. She went straight over it. She said I had been out at the laydown yard on Rice's Point on Monday morning, digging in the scrap. She said I had driven to Cloquet. I did not say anything at all for a second. And I want to be clear about what was going through me, because it was not what a father is supposed to feel when his daughter is crying at him. I was doing an inventory. Emmett had seen me at the yard, and Emmett talks to nobody. Rory would not have said a word. And there is not one living person who knew I had gone to Cloquet. Somebody was watching me. And whoever it was had gone to her with it before they had gone to anybody else, because she was the one it would work on. I did not tell her that. There was no way to say it that would not sound exactly like a man building a story. So I let her keep going, and she did. She said that on Tuesday, 2 people from the department had asked Bentley whether there was an issue with the Kestrel Point package. She said that on Wednesday morning, her husband had been pulled into a call with the funding partners and asked to confirm that the certifying engineer was, and this was the word they used, comfortable. She said the whole building was looking at her. Then she said, and her voice changed here. It came down and it got very steady, which is worse. She said, "Do you know what they think now? They think my father came in to check my work." I said her name. She said, "You have never once believed I could do anything by myself." I have gone over what happened in my chest after she said that. The closest I can get is that it was not a wound. A wound is something arriving. This was something being confirmed. Because I want to be honest with you. And I have not been honest about this yet. I kept my promise. I never made a call. Not one in 11 years. And there were times I sat with my hand on a phone, but I have read every set of drawings my daughter has ever put her name on. I got them the way anybody gets them off the public plan rooms, and I read them at that same kitchen table with a light on. And when she had a pour going at a site I would find a reason to be driving on that road at 6 in the morning, I never stopped. I never told her. For 11 years, I have been standing behind my child in the dark, checking her work. And the fact that she could not see me does not make her wrong. She was not accusing me of something I had not done. She was describing me.
I did not say any of it. What I said was that I was not trying to make trouble for her, and it came out flat and small, and it was the worst sentence available to me, and I picked it. She said, "Stay away from my job."
Then she hung up. She did not slam it. There was just the little sound of the line going, and then my kitchen. The rivet was sitting on the edge of the legal pad. When I put the phone down, my hands knocked it, and it went off the table and hit the floor and rolled, and it went in under the toe kick of the base cabinet by the stove and stopped. I did not get down after it. I sat there a while. Then I called Niklaus. He had good news, and he gave it to me first because he did not know yet what kind of call this was. He had reached Camillo Stone's people through a broker in Minneapolis. Stone was receptive. Stone was more than receptive because a private lender with $26 million out to a family whose collateral is all rented does not sleep well either. Niklaus said we could take the assignment at a premium over face and close it in 11 days. He said by the 12th of November, you will own that family. I told him to stop. He asked me to say that again, and I told him again. Do not buy the paper. Do not approach Stone. Shut it down tonight. There was a long quiet on that line, and then Niklaus Weiss, who has never in 26 years raised his voice to me, argued with me for about 4 minutes. He said it was the fastest route. He said it was the only route that did not require me to prove anything to anybody. He said, "You are 71 years old. You have no license. You have no standing on that project, and you have 7 days." He said, with the paper in hand, you can simply tell them to stop, and they will stop. And he was right. That is the thing. Every word of it was right. I told him that if I did it that way, then what happens is this. On some morning in November, men in suits arrive, and the bridge closes, and the Birch family folds up, and my daughter finds out that the reason it all went away is that her father, who she did not know had money, wrote a check. And for the rest of her life, every time she runs a number and it comes out ugly, and somebody tells her she is wrong, there will be a voice in her that says, "They were right about you before, and Dad fixed." I said I am not going to save her by proving she cannot stand up. Niklaus said, "All right." Then how? I said the same way I would find a bad weld on any job in this country, with the steel and with arithmetic in front of people where anybody can check it. And I said the part that mattered, which is that the arithmetic is not going to come from me. It is hers. It has always been hers. Somebody took it away from her, and I am going to put it back in her hands. And then I am going to get out of the way. He said, and if she will not pick it up. I said, then she will not pick it up. We hung up around midnight. At 3 in the morning, I went out to the garage and lit the stove, and clamped up a bracket for a snowplow frame that I had welded 8 months ago and that did not need anything done to it. And I ground that weld down, and I laid it back in, and then I ground it down again. Niklaus has a green shaded lamp on his desk that his father owned. He turned off the overheads and pulled that lamp down close and laid 2 sheets of paper side by side under it. They were the last pages of 2 different documents. On the left, a drawing package for a pedestrian bridge over a rail cut in 2 harbors, sealed and signed 3 years ago. On the right, the Kestrel Point Structural Conformance Report from a tin box in Cloquet. I had brought him the one on the left out of a file box in my own basement. That is the part I did not explain to him, and he did not ask. I have 11 years of my daughter's work in that basement, ordered by date, and when I went down the stairs to find a document with her seal on it, I knew exactly which shelf to put my hand on. Under that lamp at 8 o'clock at night, the 2 seals looked identical. A professional engineer's seal in this state is a ring with the words inside it, the name, the license number. It gets embossed or inked onto the certifying page, and then the engineer signs across it and writes the date in her own hand. That combination is the whole thing. It is why a bridge can be opened to the public. Niklaus had a lighted loop, the kind stamp collectors use. He gave it to me first because he had already found it and he wanted to see if I would. It took me about a minute and a half. On the seal from Two Harbors, the outer ring is broken. Not much, a nick about a 1/16 of an inch long, at what I would call the 4 o'clock position, where the ring is interrupted and picks back up. Breyer dropped that seal in a stairwell in her second year of practice. She told me about it on the phone, laughing, annoyed, because a replacement was going to cost her $90, and she did not have $90 that month. And she never did replace it. Every document my daughter has certified since 2017 carries that little break. The seal on the Kestrel Point report is perfect. The ring goes all the way around. I sat back and Niklaus took the loop and put it on the signature and told me the second half of it. The signature on that page has no variation in it. A human being signing 40 pages of a certification package produces 40 slightly different signatures because a hand gets tired and a pen catches. This one had been reproduced. The pressure was even from the first stroke to the last, the way a machine is even. The seal is a clean digital reproduction. Somebody scanned a real one and cleaned it up. They cleaned it too well. They took out the flaw. I want to say what that meant sitting there. It meant my daughter had not signed that report. It meant she had not lied to me across her desk about the load numbers, because whatever had been done to her had been done in a completely different room than the one I thought. It also meant that on the 9th of September, while she was sitting in a chair beside my hospital bed telling me not to rub my eye, somebody in that firm was putting her name on a bridge. Then Niklaus gave me the rest. Every design firm carries professional liability coverage, and when a firm sees a problem coming, it has to notify its insurer. That notification is called a circumstance report. Harvey & Associates filed one on the Kestrel Point project on the 22nd of September, 13 days after that seal went on the paper. And attached to it were 3 internal memoranda written by Bentley Harvey. The first is dated in April. It says that the project engineer produced a computational error in a deck drainage calculation, that it was caught in review, and that Mr. Harvey had a supportive conversation with her about workload. The second is dated in June. It says that a second error occurred, that the engineer appeared fatigued, and that Mr. Harvey had encouraged her to take time. The third is dated the 19th of September. It says that the project engineer had raised a live load concern that was reviewed by an outside consultant and found to be an error, that she had been visibly distressed, and that Mr. Harvey was documenting a pattern of overload and difficulty with self-correction out of concern for the firm and for her. I read all 3 twice. There is no supportive conversation in any of them. There is a person building a file. And the outside consultant who reviewed my daughter's number and found it in error has a sole practitioner license, an office that is his house, and 6 engagements in 3 years. And every single one of those 6 was paid by an entity connected to Birch Capital Partners. That was when it came apart for me, all at once, the way it does. We had been asking the wrong question for 4 days. We had been asking what in that project was worth $26 million. Nothing in it was. There is no pot of money buried in a river crossing, but there is a difference between 2 outcomes, and that difference is worth everything. If that bridge comes apart, and the cause is found to be substituted material, then Maximo Birch and Princeton Pittman are looking at federal charges. The firm is finished. The family is finished. And Camilo Stone's $26 million is collected out of whatever is left of their bones. If that bridge comes apart, and the cause is found to be an engineering error, then the material never comes up. The design firm's professional liability carrier pays. Niklaus checked the policy limit on that project, $30 million. And the owner, the injured party, the family whose name is on the bronze plaque, files the claim. They were not going to steal anything from my daughter. There was never anything of hers they wanted. What they needed was a name on the last page of a document and a paper record explaining why a young woman with a name like that would have gotten a number wrong and a bridge that was going to do what that steel was always going to do. I said it out loud in that office because I needed to hear whether it sounded insane. She is not being robbed. She was picked. Niklaus did not answer me. He got up and went to the window and stood there with his hands behind his back, and I stayed in the chair. Down on Superior Street, somebody was running a sidewalk blower, even though there was nothing yet to blow. The radiator under the window knocked twice and settled. Out past the streetlight, the first snow of the year was coming down, not falling straight, going sideways across the light and then out of it, the way it does off the lake, and it was not sticking to anything. I thought about a young man giving a wrench one more quarter turn and saying it was for his mother. After a while, Niklaus said, "We take this to the department in the morning." He said it the way a man says a thing he has already stopped believing while it is still in his mouth. I said, "Take what?" I told him what we had. A piece of scrap steel that I took out of a private yard without asking anybody, measured by me, and I have not held a valid welding certification since 2008. A 3-year-old non-conformance report written by an inspector whose license was pulled by the state for accepting a bribe, and a photocopy of a certification page that we obtained from a man living in a trailer, which we cannot explain how we got without telling them who carried it out there. I said a welder with an expired card and an inspector who lost his license. Who do you think is going to believe that in the next 3 days? Rory came out of his back bedroom at 6 in the morning wearing a company jacket from 1986 with the old logo on the shoulder, and he held his arms out at his sides and said it had been 40 years since anybody let him lie to a man for a living. What we needed was very simple and almost impossible. We needed to be legally standing on that bridge. A closed project is not a public place. You cannot walk on it. You cannot put a gauge on it. And anything you take off it is stolen. Everything I had was scrap and photocopies. What I did not have was one measurement taken on that structure by somebody who had a right to be there. There is exactly one kind of person who is allowed to walk out on a finished bridge with tools in his hands, and that is a contractor with a signed scope of work. Commonwealth Fabrication has existed since 1991. I named it after the street I live on. It has a state contractor registration, a general liability policy, and a bank account with $1,100 in it. And for the last 19 years, its entire annual activity has been a renewal fee. It is not a front. It is a real, small, boring company that happens to be mine and does not have my other name anywhere on it. Niklaus found the opening in the punch list. Every project has one. On the final walk in September, the department's inspector wrote up 11 items, and item 4 was that 6 handrail posts on the north abutment had visible undercut at the base welds and required repair prior to opening. It was small, it was real, it was nobody's priority with a ribbon cutting coming, and it had been sitting there for 6 weeks. So on Thursday morning, I put on clean work clothes and I drove out to the site trailer. And I asked my son-in-law for a job. I want you to understand what that was. He knew exactly who I was. That is the part I need to say plainly, because I have heard people tell this kind of story, where the rich man walks in disguised and nobody knows him. And that is not what happened, and it would have been easier if it had been. Princeton Pittman looked up from a desk in a construction trailer and saw his wife's father standing in the doorway with a folder, and he smiled. He was glad to see me. He got up and came around the desk. I told him Commonwealth had done a lot of handrail and stair work over the years, that I had seen the punch list item in the department's public log, and that I would do the 6 posts at cost because I wanted the work. Then I let him look at me while I said the rest of it. I said I had been sitting in that house since Saturday with nothing to do. I said a man my age needs a reason to put his boots on. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Of course." He said, "Frank, of course, and I want you to know that what happened at the dedication has been eating at my father. It truly has." He said, "This is family." He said, "We take care of family." Then he sat back down and he moved the stapler on his desk about an inch to the left so that it was square with the edge. And while he was doing that, he said, without any change in his voice at all, that I had been keeping busy this week. I said I had been driving around some. He said, "That is good for a man.
Get out of the house." I have replayed that exchange 100 times. He was not threatening me. He was doing something worse than that. He was letting me know that he could see me, and that what he saw did not worry him even slightly, and that giving me a badge and a scope of work was less risky to him than leaving me out where he could not watch. He wanted me on that site. It cost him nothing, and it put an old man where he could keep an eye on him. That is the mistake. That is the entire mistake right there. And he made it because he had decided what I was in about 9 seconds sometime last spring, and had never once gone back to check his work. The paperwork took 40 minutes. Certificate of insurance, W-9, safety orientation, a badge with my picture on it that I clipped to my jacket. Then Bentley Harvey came in to countersign as engineer of record. He was carrying a coffee and he was already smiling, and he said good morning to the room, and Princeton slid the packet across the desk to him. Bentley read it standing up, the way you do when you intend to sign something in 8 seconds and get on with your day. He turned the first page. He turned the second. On the qualification sheet, where it lists the certified welder proposed for the work, it says F. Everett, and under that, the fabricator experience, and in that block, it says Everett Steel Erectors, 1974 through 2008. Because that is true, and because a qualification sheet is a sworn document, and I was not going to lie on one. He stopped. He did not look at the page any longer than a man would who was reading carefully. He looked up at me instead. And I watched Bentley Harvey stand in a construction trailer and try to make two things fit together, and I watched him get about 3/4 of the way there. 11 months ago, a steel erection company out of Duluth bid that bridge and lost it. And Bentley Harvey read that bid, because reviewing bidders is what an engineer of record does. And he had signed the letter that said the pricing could not be justified. And now, here was the name again, on a handrail repair, on a man in his 60s or 70s, with a badge clipped to a work jacket. He could have asked one question. Any one of about 4 questions would have ended it that morning. He looked at Princeton, then he looked back at me, and he smiled the way he does before he says something, except that this time, he did not say anything at all, and he clicked his pen and signed both copies and handed one to me and said, "Welcome aboard." That was the second mistake, and it was not made out of arrogance. It was made by a frightened man who had already started looking around for a boat and who had just decided that whatever this was, it was not his to notice. Princeton stood up and put out his hand. I have shaken hands on every deal I ever made. I did business for 20 years without a written contract because in this trade, a hand meant a thing. I took my son-in-law's hand in that trailer, and I shook it, and I said thank you, and I looked him in the face while I did it. Out in the truck, I sat for a minute before I started it. Then I called Niklaus and asked him about recording. He said in this state, you may record any conversation you are a party to. He said it twice, and then he said the rest of it slowly. You may not leave a device running in a room you have walked out of. If you are not in it, it is not yours. I told him I understood. The subcontractor coordination meeting for the opening week is held in the field office container at the north abutment. It is one long box with a partition down the middle, plywood hollow with a door in it. It was on the schedule for 7 o'clock the next morning, and as of 11:20 that Thursday, I was a subcontractor. The field office container sits on blocking at the north abutment, and at 20 to 7 on Friday morning, the wind was coming in through the gap at the bottom of the door and moving the papers on the wall. There are 2 fluorescent tubes in that box. One of them was going. Not flickering the way they do when they are about to quit, but the slower thing, where the light drops about a fifth and comes back every 11 or 12 seconds, so that you stop noticing it and then your eyes get tired anyway. There were 7 of us at the coordination meeting. Paving, striping, electrical, the barricade company, the department's field engineer, a young woman from the general contractor with a laptop, and me. It was an ordinary meeting. That is worth saying. Men in that trade sit in that box on 100,000 mornings a year,
and talk about deliveries and lane closures, and who is going to be in whose way. And it is the least dramatic thing on this earth. My item took 90 seconds. 6 handrail posts, north abutment, undercut at the base. I said I would grind out and re-weld all 6 of them, and I asked for a work window. They gave me Saturday morning, 6 o'clock to 8:30. The site had to be clear by 8:45 for the ceremony setup. I wrote it on my daily. Saturday, 6 to 8:30, on the deck. Then the field engineer left and the subs started standing up, and Princeton, who had not run the meeting and had been sitting against the back wall the whole time on his phone, said, "Gentlemen, give us 5 minutes on an internal item." Everybody filed out. I took my folder and my tool bag, and I went through the door in the partition into the other half of the container, which is where the plan table and the daily reports are, and where a subcontractor writes up his paperwork. And I sat down at the table with my badge on and my forms in front of me. I want to be exact about this. I was in that building because I had a contract and a badge and a form to fill out. I did not put anything anywhere. I did not stand at the wall with a glass. I sat at a plan table 11 feet from a sheet of 1/4-inch plywood, and I filled out a daily work report, and I could hear everything. And so could anybody else who had been sitting there. Whether that makes what came through that wall mine or theirs is a question I did not have an answer to that morning. And Niklaus did not have a clean answer for it later either. And I want you to hold on to that, because it matters. Maximo Birch came in the other door. I heard the truck first, and then his voice, and he did not say hello to anybody. He said, "Are we clear?" Bentley Harvey started talking. Bentley was worried. You could hear it, and I do not think he could. He went around it for a while, procedurally, the way a man does, and then he got there. He said the load test protocol calls for 12 loaded triaxles staged and running the deck, and he said that the north approach spans were the ones the department had asked questions about in September. And he said that he would feel considerably better if they postponed the test 2 weeks and did it with 8 trucks. There was a pause, and then Maximo Birch said no. He said the governor's office had confirmed. He said the funding partners had confirmed. He said a postponement 3 days after a public dedication is a story, and the one thing they were not going to have was a story, Bentley said. And if something happens during the test. And Maximo said in the same voice he had used at that microphone about the working people of this city, that something happens on about 1 job in 400, that it is a number that everybody in this business carries that number, and that a man who cannot carry it should be in a different business. He said, that is what the coverage is for. I sat at that plan table with a pen in my hand, and I did not move. Then Princeton took over, and this is the part I am going to give you, as close to the way it came through that wall as I can. He said the contingency was fully papered. He said it the way you would report that the concrete tickets were filed. He walked his father through it. There is an April memorandum documenting a computational error by the project engineer. There is a June memorandum documenting fatigue. There is a September memorandum documenting a live load concern that an independent reviewer determined to be in error. There is a circumstance report on file with the carrier since the 22nd of September. And there is a sealed and signed structural conformance certification on which the department opened this bridge. He said if anything happens, the paper walks it into design and it stays there. He said we are not the ones holding it. And Bentley Harvey, who I do not think is a brave man, but who was not made entirely out of nothing either, said, "And your wife." Princeton did not lower his voice. That is the thing I want to be understood. He did not drop it. He did not glance at the door. He did not have any of the reflexes a man has when he is saying something he knows is shameful. He said the seal is the seal. It does its job or it does not. My hand went up to my shirt pocket. It has gone there 10,000 times in 47 years, and it always found the same thing. And that morning, it found cloth and a pen and nothing else. Because the rivet was lying under the toe kick of a kitchen cabinet on Commonwealth Avenue, where it had rolled 2 nights before and where I had left it. The one tube dropped a fifth of its light and came back. Outside, a long way off, toward the ore dock, a gull was going at something and would not stop. There was a smell of diesel and cold water in that container that I have smelled every working day of my life. I sat there with my hand flat against an empty pocket, and what came up was my daughter, at 7 years old, at the kitchen table with a pencil, redoing a long division problem she had already gotten right. Because the little calculator I had bought her had told her a different answer, and she did not believe the calculator. And I had stood at the sink and watched her do it, and I had not said one word to her about it. On the other side of that plywood, somebody moved a chair. Maximo asked whether there was any exposure on the filings. Princeton said no. He said my mother handles that side. He said it in 4 words and went straight past it to the barricade schedule, and I would not think about that sentence again for 8 days. Then the meeting broke up and I had to walk out through them. I put my daily in the tray and I went out through the first half of the container, and Princeton was standing by the door with his coffee, and he said, "Morning, Frank. Saturday, right? 6 o'clock. I said 6 o'clock. Out in the yard, the staging had started. They were bringing the triaxles in and lining them up nose to tail along the frontage road so that they would be ready, and I stood on the step of that container and counted them. I got to 9. 3 more were coming in off the highway. 26 hours. The district office is a brick building up the hill with a parking lot full of orange trucks, and at 11 o'clock on Friday morning, I sat down across a table from the department's bridge maintenance engineer and put a piece of scrap steel on it. Aaliyah Fernandez is 41. She had a folder, a pen, and no coffee. She let me get the whole thing out without interrupting once, which almost nobody does. And when I finished, she said 4 words. She said, "Show me the numbers." So I did. The caliper readings in 4 places. The photographs of the coped corner and the ground-off producer stamp. The 3-year-old non-conformance from a senior housing job in Superior. The last page of a conformance report with a seal on it that has no break in the ring. She read for 11 minutes. She measured that plate herself with her own micrometer twice and wrote both readings in her folder. Then she put the pen down and told me what I had. The plate came out of a private yard. I did not have written permission from the leaseholder, which means it has no chain of custody, which means that as evidence, it is a story about a piece of metal. The nonconformance was written by a man whose license this state revoked for accepting a payment, which means that in any proceeding, the first 11 minutes will be about him and not about the steel. And the certification page is a photocopy that came to me from that same man, and I could not tell her how it got to him without telling her who carried it there. I said you have a micrometer and a bridge 4 miles from this building. Go put it on the steel. She said she could not, and she explained why. And she was right. A finished structure is not hers to open up on a Friday afternoon. She can order a verification inspection. That order goes through a district process, it gets scheduled, and it happens on a working day. The soonest was Monday. The load test is Saturday at 2. I asked her what would move it. She thought about it for a while, and I want to say that she took it seriously because she did. And she has since done things that cost her something. She said to stop a governor's ceremony 22 hours out, I need something that survives a phone call from the commissioner's office. She said that means a document, and it means a name on the record. Specifically, she said 2 things. She needed the original live load calculation from the design firm, the actual file with a verifiable timestamp showing the discrepancy as it existed before anybody reviewed it away. And she needed the certifying engineer to state on the record in her own name that the seal on that report is not hers. I said, and if the certifying engineer will not. Aaliyah Fernandez looked at me across that table and did not answer, because she is not in the business of saying out loud what happens to a young woman who does not. Nicole Mahoney met me an hour later in the parking lot behind the paper, because there was no room free inside. She is 36. She smokes about 4 a day, and she was down to her second. She listened with the engine off and then said the same thing Aaliyah had in the other language. She said, I can write it tonight. I cannot get it printed without a credentialed person on the record, because a bridge story with no engineer in it is a lawsuit, and this paper cannot afford one. Then she said, I have been here before with these people. I asked her about Cook. She had the whole thing in a banker's box in her trunk, which tells you something about a person. She got out and opened it, and she went through it standing in the cold with her cigarette in her teeth, and she found the memo and she handed it to me. It was 3 years old, internal 4 sentences from an editor who is not there anymore. It said the Cook piece was being held indefinitely on advice of counsel following contact from an interested party. And it named the party because internal memos do. It was my company. I read it twice. Everett Steel Erectors, through outside counsel, had contacted that paper regarding the article, had noted its position as the paper's largest continuous advertiser through its ironworker recruitment program, and had put the paper on notice of the potential for defamation exposure. And underneath that, in one line, the reason. The steel on that senior housing job in Superior was erected by my company. My crews put it up. Uriel Cook's nonconformance named a material substitution in members that my men set. If that story had run, the name in the second paragraph would have been Everett Steel Erectors. So 9 people I have never sat down with in a boardroom I have not been in since 2014 did exactly what a board is supposed to do. They protected the company. It was not corrupt. Nobody took anything. There is not one person in that room I could put a name to and hate. And a 62-year-old man lost his license, his wife, and his house, and went to live in a rented lot outside Cloquet, with a dog chain in the yard, and no dog on the end of it. I told you I stopped reading those reports because I did not want to reach in and move things. That was a lie, and I did not know it was one until I was standing in that parking lot. I stopped reading them because I have not trusted myself to be the man who decides anything since the 10th of October 1979. And I built an entire company shaped like a place where I would never have to. Nicole asked if I was all right. I said I was. I sat in her car for a while after she went back inside. She had left the keys and told me to come find her. The windows fogged from the inside. Somebody in the loading bay was breaking down cardboard and throwing it into a baler, and each one made a flat sound and then a pause. I had both hands on the top of the wheel. I did not turn the key. There was a plastic hula figure glued to her dash that somebody had given her as a joke, and it went on nodding at nothing every time the baler slammed. I sat there about 6 minutes. Then I called Niklaus and told him where we were, and Niklaus, who is very good at his job, gave me a way out inside of 40 seconds. He said the design firm's professional liability carrier has a contractual right to the project file. He said the carrier is already on notice, and I know their coverage counsel. He said I can have a preservation demand on Harvey & Associates before 5 o'clock tonight and their server images by tomorrow noon. He said we might get the original calculation without going anywhere near her. I stood in the cold and thought about it. If we did it that way, the file arrives in a lawyer's hands. Aaliyah gets a document with a lawyer's cover letter on it. My daughter learns at some point afterward that the thing which cleared her name was extracted from her employer's server by a firm she had never heard of, paid for by her father. She would be innocent. She would never once be right. I told Niklaus no. I said the calculation is hers. She ran it. She trusted it. She took it to her boss, and they spent 6 weeks convincing her she could not count. Nobody is going to hand that back to her in an envelope. She is going to pick it up herself, and she is going to say it out loud with her own mouth, or it does not get said. He said, and if she will not open the door, I said I had about 19 hours to find out. It went from snow to sleet around 8 o'clock, and I stood across the street from their building on the waterfront for 11 minutes without going in. I was not working up to it. I was trying to decide whether I had the right, because what I was about to ask my daughter to do is the exact thing I did not do on the 10th of October, 1979. And I had seen that afternoon precisely what this state does to a person who does it. I had a piece of steel in a canvas bag and no promise at all. I went up at 8:20 and rang the bell. She opened the door in a cardigan with the sleeves pulled down over her hands, and she had lost weight since I had seen her. and she started to close it. I did not put my hand out to stop her. I did not say anything about her mother or about being sorry. I set the bag on the floor of the entry, and I took out the piece of web plate, and I put it on the table by the door. I said, "Knock on it." She looked at me the way you look at a person you have decided is not well. I said it again, "Knock on it." She made a small sound, half a laugh, the kind people make when they are furious and cornered and about to do the thing just to end it. And she reached out and hit that plate twice with the back of a knuckle. Then she went completely still. She hit it again. Then she picked it up and turned it over and looked at the coped corner and the paint, and she said, "Where did this come from?" I told her. Rice's Point, Sunday morning, out of the drop pile, north girder line, and I told her the 4 readings. She carried it into the kitchen and set it on the counter under the light and stood over it with both hands flat on the granite and did not say anything for a long time. Then she asked why I was doing this, and she did not ask it the way she had on the phone. She asked it like she wanted an answer, so I gave her one. I told her the whole thing standing up in a coat in her kitchen. I told her about a grain terminal across the bay in 1979 and a transfer beam with a bad fit-up. I told her that I knocked on it, and it answered me long, and I knew, and that a man at the bottom of a ladder asked me what time we would top out, and that I said, "Run it." I told her about a 19-year-old connector named Noah Moses, who put 1 extra quarter turn on every bolt and said it was for his mother. She had not heard any of it. 29 years, and I had never once opened my mouth about it. Then I told her the other one, because you do not get to confess the old thing and keep the new one. I told her that 3 years ago, an inspector named Uriel Cook wrote up substituted steel on a birch job in Superior, and that the men who set that steel worked for a company that I own, and never told her about. And that when a reporter tried to run the story, my company's lawyers made a phone call, and the story died. And that man lost everything. I told her I had not known, and I told her that not knowing had been a thing I arranged. She said, "You own a company." I said, "Yes." I said what it was and what it was worth, and I watched it land, and it landed nowhere near where I expected. She did not ask about the money. She stood there in her own kitchen at 8:40 at night and said, "You have been reading my drawings." I said, "Every one of them. Since your first summer." She said, "Why?" And I gave her the only true answer I have. I said, "I do not trust me. I have never once in my life not trusted you." She put her hand over her mouth and turned around and faced the window. When she turned back, she started talking, and she did not stop for about 6 minutes, and I am not going to give you all of it because some of it was not mine. The short version is this. In April, a drainage calculation she had run 3 times came back wrong in review. In June, it happened again. By August, she was checking her own work 4 and 5 times and staying late to do it, and Bentley Harvey was being very kind to her about it. And Princeton had started asking her gently in the car whether she thought she had taken on too much this year. And in September, she found the live load number. She took it to Bentley on a Thursday. The outside reviewer came back in 9 days and walked her through her error, and she said she still could not follow the explanation, but that everyone in the room could, and so she signed off on being wrong. Then I asked her about the seal, and my daughter said the thing that I will hear for the rest of my life. She said, "I saw it on the certification page in October, and I thought I must have sealed it and forgotten." That is what 6 months of it does. They did not have to forge anything past her. They only had to build a woman who would look at a forgery of her own name and assume she had lost the day. I took out the loop Niklaus had given me and the drawing from 2 harbors, and I laid the 2 seals side by side under the light, and I did not point at anything. It took her about 4 seconds. She is faster than me. She said the ring is closed. Then she went and got her laptop, and we sat down, and inside 20 minutes, we knew. The calculation file on the firm's server was replaced in September, and the version history only goes back to the replacement. Her machine had been re-imaged on the 24th of September, which she had been told was a security upgrade. Her sent mail from that Thursday in September was gone. They had cleaned all of it. She sat back in the chair, and she was shaking in the hands, and she put them under the table. I did not reach over. My daughter was sitting 18 inches from me, coming apart, and I did not put a hand on her because I did not know if I still had the standing to, and because if she had pulled away from me right then, I do not think I would have gotten up off that chair. I put my hand flat on the table, about 10 inches from hers, and left it there. After a while, she got up and went into the other room and came back with a black notebook with a red spine, and she put it in front of me and turned it to a page near the back. There it was, her handwriting. The load case, the distribution factors, the number, all of it worked out in pencil. And in the top corner, in her hand, the date, the 11th of September. And under it, a second entry in different ink dated 8 days later. It said copies to You Cook, Cloquet. I looked up at her. She said I drove out there on the 19th. I left him the report, and I left him this page, and I asked him not to tell anybody. Because if it got back to the firm that I had gone to a decertified inspector, I was finished. Uriel Cook has kept an inspection log every working day for 31 years. Nothing goes into that man's hands without a date and his initials next to it. I said her name. Then the front door opened behind us. Princeton came in with his keys in his hand and stopped when he saw us at the table. He recovered fast, I have to give him that. Inside about a second and a half, he had a smile on, and he said Frank and he looked at the notebook and the loop and the piece of gray steel sitting on his kitchen counter, and he did not ask one question about any of it. He said it is late. He said it to me, but he was watching her. And my daughter closed that notebook and stood up and said, I am going to my father's tonight. That was all she said. She did not accuse him of anything, and she did not explain herself. And I understood, standing there in my coat, that she had decided something in the last 20 minutes that she was not going to argue about with anybody. He tried 3 different ways in about 40 seconds. Concern, then reason, then the last one where he told her that she was not well and that she knew she was not well. She put on her boots. He did not touch her. He wanted to. There was a moment in the entry where his weight came forward and I moved. And I am 71 years old and I do not know what I was going to do. And he saw whatever was on my face and he stopped. We went out. She did not take a bag. She took the notebook. Nobody slept much at my house. Niklaus came over at 11 with a briefcase. Nicole Mahoney came at midnight and stayed until 2 and rode in my kitchen with her coat on. At 1 in the morning, Aaliyah Fernandez answered her phone at home and listened to Breyer for 19 minutes and then said one sentence, which was, put all of it in front of me by 7 and I will do what I can. And at 10 minutes to 6 on Saturday morning, in the dark, in the cold, Uriel Cook pulled up at the north abutment in a truck older than mine. He got out with the foam-lined case under his arm. He walked past me. He went to my daughter and he held it out to her with both hands, the way you hand somebody a tool that matters. And he said, it is calibrated and the certificate is in the lid. She said, thank you, Mr. Cook. He said, you came out there in September and I did not do one thing about it. She said you kept the page. Then she took the case and clipped her badge on, and we went up onto the bridge. I had a work window from 6 to 8:30 and 6 handrail posts to fix, and I fixed them. I want that on the record. I ground out the undercut at all 6 bases, and I laid in new fillet, and I dressed them, and they are good welds, and they are up there right now. While I did that, the certifying project engineer of record for the Kestrel Point River Crossing, badged, licensed, and standing lawfully on her own project, took ultrasonic thickness readings at 14 locations along the north approach girder line. She wrote every one of them in the notebook by hand. 11 of the 14 came in under the specified 5/8. The worst was at the 3rd diaphragm connection, and it read just over 1/2 inch. She did the arithmetic on the tailgate of my truck with the sun not up yet and her breath showing. At 8:30, we came off the deck because we were required to, and by 8:45 the site was clear. And by 5 to 9, there were 200 folding chairs, a podium with the state seal on it, the barricade company holding traffic at both approaches, and 12 loaded tri-axle ore trucks lined up nose to tail on the frontage road with their engines running to keep the drivers warm. Maximo Birch came across the gravel at me before I got 20 feet. He was not angry. That is the thing I want to be clear about because I had expected anger. And I got something much older than that. He said my name, and then he said, "Let us not do this." He laid it out in under a minute. He is a fluent man. He said that whatever I thought I had the department was not going to move on it this morning, and that the load test would proceed, and that on Monday there would be a verification inspection, and if there was a problem, it would be handled properly. And then he gave me the actual offer. He said, "Your daughter is 29. He said there are 3 memoranda in a firm's personnel file and a circumstance report with a carrier, and those things follow an engineer for 30 years. He said none of that has to exist. He said, "Walk to your truck." Then Maximo Birch put out his hand. It was the same hand. That is not a thing I am putting in for effect. It was the same right hand that had gone between my shoulder blades on a Friday night 8 days before. And it was clean. And it was out there in the air between us. And there were people watching from the chairs. I looked at it for a while. Then I looked past him at those 12 trucks and at the drivers standing around the lead one with coffee, 4 of them in high-visibility jackets. Ordinary men on a Saturday. And at the 200 folding chairs. I have thought a great deal about what I gave up in that 30 seconds. If I had taken that hand, my daughter would have a career this morning. He would have kept his word. Men like that do keep that kind of word because it costs them nothing, and it is the only kind they have. I did not take it. I said no, and I went around him. The department's field engineer for that project is a young man named Aldous, who I had sat across from in the container the day before. He was at the podium, checking a cable. I walked up to him with my badge on my jacket and my contract in my hand, and I said the 4 words that are the only real authority I have ever had in this world. I said I am stopping work. Every job site in this country runs on that, not on money and not on a license. Any worker on any project who sees a condition he believes is unsafe can call a stop, and everything halts until it is looked at. And that right belongs to the man who is standing there, whether he has a certificate on his wall or a lunch bucket in his truck. Aldous looked at the crowd and at the governor's advance person and back at me. Then he unclipped the microphone and handed it to me. I have never spoken in front of 200 people. I did not have anything written down, and I am not a man who is any good at this. So I did not make a speech. I walked to the north end of the deck where the concrete meets the abutment in front of the chairs and the cameras and the podium with the state seal, and I put my left hand flat on the top flange of the main girder, the way I have done 10,000 times. The steel was cold enough that it took hold of the skin of my palm for a second when I lifted my hand off it, the way it does in November, the way it has every November of my life. I made a fist. I brought the microphone up next to it, and I knocked on that steel twice with the second knuckle. The sound came out of the loudspeakers over the whole north approach and went out across the water long and thin, and it did not want to stop. Nobody in those 200 chairs said one word. The echo went out over the water and came apart somewhere past the channel, and while it was still dying in those loudspeakers, I said the only thing I know how to say. I said, "Good steel answers you once." I said that a piece of plate that is the thickness it is supposed to be gives you back one short, hard sound and then quits, and that a piece that is thin will keep talking, and that any man who has spent a winter on a deck knows the difference in his hand before he knows it in his head. Then I said, "Do not take my word for it. Come up here and hit it." Nobody moved for about 4 seconds. Then one of the truck drivers came. He was a big man in a high-visibility jacket, 60 or so, with his coffee still in his hand. And he came up the slope past the barricade with everybody watching him, and he did not look at the crowd once. He set the coffee on the abutment. He put his fist on that flange and knocked twice. Then he stood there with his hand still on the steel. He turned around and he looked out at those 200 folding chairs. And he said, "That is not right." After that, 4 more came. And then the governor of this state, in a good coat, walked out onto the deck and knocked on a bridge with his own knuckle in front of 3 cameras. That was when Maximo Birch got to the second microphone. He was very good, I have to say that. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize." He said this gentleman was asked to leave a private function last week. He is my son's father-in-law, and this is a family matter that does not belong on a public bridge. He said, I am not going to stand here and let a man's personal grievance become a public panic. And that is a strong play, and it works about 95 times out of 100. And the only reason it did not work that morning is that he had never once in 11 months read the file. I said, my name is Francisco Everett. I said that in 1974, I bought a used flatbed and a welding rig and started a company called Everett Steel Erectors. That it puts up structural steel in 14 states, that I have owned all of it by myself through a trust for 47 years, and that until this minute, there were 4 people alive who knew that. I let that sit for a second because I needed the next part to land. I said 11 months ago, my company bid the steel on this bridge. I said we were rejected. The letter is in the department's public file, and any one of you can pull it this afternoon. It says our pricing came in 14% above the selected fabricator and could not be justified to the funding partners. Then I told them what 14% is. 14% is almost exactly what you save when you buy secondary and off-spec plate on the broker market instead of certified prime domestic steel. It is not a margin. It is not efficiency. It is the price of the difference between the material on the drawings and the material in that girder. I said we were not expensive. We were honest, and honest costs 14%. And that is the whole reason there is a thin bridge under your feet this morning. Somewhere back in the chairs, a woman said something out loud that I did not catch. Bentley Harvey was standing at the end of the second row, and he had gone the color of a drop cloth. Then I said the last thing I had to say, and it was 5 words. I said, I am not the engineer, and I handed the microphone to my daughter. Breyer came up onto the abutment in a work coat with a badge clipped to it, and a black notebook in her left hand, and she did not thank anybody for their time. She said her name. She said her license number out loud, the way you do when you are certifying something and you intend to be held to it. Then she read the 14 ultrasonic thickness readings she had taken on that structure between 6 and 8:30 that morning with a calibrated gauge, and she gave the location of each one, and she gave the number, and she said the specified value was 5/8. She read all 14. It took a while. She did not hurry it, and she did not editorialize once. 11 of them were under. Then she turned back a few pages in that notebook and she said, on the 11th of September of this year, I ran the live load distribution on the north approach spans, and I got a number I did not like. And I ran it twice more and got it again. And I wrote it in this book in pencil on that date, and I reported it to my firm on the following Thursday. She read that number out loud, too. Then she said I was told I was wrong. I accepted that. That was my mistake, and it is the only one I made on this project. She closed the notebook. I was standing about 8 feet behind her that whole time, with my hands at my sides, and I did not look at her once. I looked at the water. I have thought about why, and the truth is that if I had looked at my daughter right then, I would not have been able to go on standing where I was. And then she said the thing that ended it. She said the certification page in the Structural Safety Conformance Report for this bridge carries my name and my seal. I did not apply it. My seal has had a break in the outer ring at the 4 o'clock position since I dropped it in a stairwell in 2017. Every document I have certified in 8 years carries that break. The impression on that report does not. She said that seal is a forgery, and I am reporting it as one on the record right now. Nobody said anything at all. The wind came across the channel and moved the bunting on the podium, and out on the frontage road 12 diesel engines were still running at idle, and that was the only sound there was. Aaliyah Fernandez came up the deck with her radio already in her hand. She did not use the microphone. She spoke to the field engineer, and she spoke to her district office, and she read out the structure number, and she ordered the crossing closed to all traffic pending verification inspection, effective immediately. And she directed that the load test be canceled. Then she said one more thing into that radio, and it was the sentence, I will keep. She said, stand the trucks down. They shut off from the back of the line forward. You could hear each one let go, one after another, 12 of them. And when the last one quit, the whole north side of that river went quiet enough to hear the water. Uriel Cook was standing at the back by the barricade with his hands in his coat pockets. Nicole Mahoney was next to him with a recorder up. He was not looking at the podium. He was looking at the bridge. Then Princeton came through the chairs. He came fast up the center past his father, and he was not smooth anymore, and there was nothing on his face that I had ever seen on it before. He got to the edge of the abutment, and he reached out for that notebook in my daughter's hand. She stepped back and held it against her chest. And Princeton Pittman said loudly in front of 200 people, 4 feet from an open microphone that was still hot and still going out over every loudspeaker on that approach, "You do not get to do this. You are the SEAL. Handcuffs do not sound the way they do in movies. They make a small, dry sound, like a zipper." There was a state patrol sergeant working traffic control at the South Barricade that morning, and when Princeton put his hand out toward my daughter and took a step, that sergeant was on the abutment in about 4 seconds. He did not arrest him for anything to do with a bridge. He arrested him for putting his hands on a woman in front of 200 witnesses, which is the smallest thing Princeton Pittman did in 11 months. And the only one that could be charged that day. Everything else took longer, the way everything else does. The state's investigators had the audio off that public address system by noon, and they had Uriel Cook's inspection log initialed and dated the 19th of September by Monday. Wade Bowman came in on his own 2 weeks later and gave 4 hours of statement about what came off the trucks on night shift in August, and Rory sat in the parking lot the whole time in his own truck and would not come in. Bentley Harvey lasted 9 days. Then he walked into the county attorney's office with his own lawyer and handed over the April memorandum, the June memorandum, the September memorandum, the invoice trail on the outside reviewer, and every email he had. I do not have any feeling about him at all. He was a frightened man who did the arithmetic on which side was going to be standing, and did it about 11 months too late. Maximo Birch went down on his knees in the gravel that Saturday morning. Not to me. I want to be precise because people ask about that part. He went down maybe 15 feet from where I was standing with his hands out, and he was saying something about his heart, and his face was turned toward the cameras the entire time. And I laughed. One sound. It came up out of me before I knew it was coming. And it was not a good sound, and it did not have any joy in it. And I heard it go out over that gravel, and I have not been able to explain it since. Rory heard it. He is the only one who did. Then he took my elbow and walked me down the slope, away from all of it, and I sat down on the curb of that frontage road with my boots in the gutter. I could not get the cap off a bottle of water. I had it in both hands, and I could not do it. 71 years old, 47 of them on the iron, and my hands were going badly enough that a plastic cap was past me. Rory did not say anything about it. He took the bottle, cracked it, and handed it back, and then he stood next to me with both hands on that aluminum cane and looked out at the water and let me sit there. We stayed about 20 minutes. Neither of us said one word. The last piece did not come until the following Tuesday, and it came from Niklaus, who had gone back to the thing I told him to leave alone. He got through the nominee arrangement on Halberd Metals. The manager of record on every filing is Princeton Pittman. His signature is on all of it. But the membership interest, the actual ownership of that company, every dollar that ever came out of it, has been held since the day it was organized by his mother, Marie Rogers, 58 years old. Her name is on nothing anybody would ever look at, and it is on the only thing that mattered. She had arranged it so that her son signed. All of it. Every document, every certification package, every transfer. If it ever came apart, there would be one man's name across all of it, and a woman who kept the books at home. I went to the arraignment. I sat in the back. When they brought Princeton in, Marie Rogers was in the second row. He looked for her the whole way across that room. She had her hands folded in her lap on top of her purse, and she looked back at him, and she did not move them. She never touched him, not once on the way in or on the way out. 5 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, in a hearing room in St. Paul, the State Board of Engineering licensure vacated its 2022 order against Uriel Cook and restored his certification. Breyer testified for 19 minutes. I sat in the back of that room too. When it was done, Uriel came up the aisle with the order in his hand, and he did not say anything, and he put his hand out, and I took it. It was warm.
In a trailer outside Cloquet in the last week of October, that same hand had been cold enough that I noticed it. And I did not say anything about that then, and I did not say anything about it now. Nicole Mahoney's piece ran across the top of the front page the same week, and then it ran everywhere else. She spent about a third of it on a bridge, and the rest of it on a man in a trailer outside Cloquet, which is the correct proportion. The North Approach spans came down in April. They took out 4 girder lines and every plate that came off a broker in Rotterdam, and they built it back with certified domestic steel. And it cost this state $9 million and 8 months. They did not have to take out the whole bridge. Most of it was fine. That is the thing nobody tells you about a job like that. You do not get to condemn all of it and start over clean. You take out the part that is bad, and the rest of it stays up, and it carries traffic every day with a repair in it, and everybody who drives across it knows. I read the quarterly report that November, the first one in 7 years. Then I read the 6 before it, and in January I went to a board meeting in a room I had not sat in since 2014. And I sat at the end of the table, and I asked 9 people some questions about a phone call to a newspaper 3 years ago. That is not a scene I am going to give you. It was not dramatic. 2 of them are gone now, and the ones who stayed are better. Breyer opened her own office in March. 2nd floor over a print shop on Superior Street, 2 people her name on the glass, and a licensed structural engineer named Devora. She stole from a firm in St. Cloud. She did not ask me for $1. I did not offer her one. That is not a coldness between us. It is the shape of the only agreement we have ever had, and both of us understood by then exactly what it had cost and exactly what it was worth. In May, I moved the stove out from the wall in my kitchen, got down on the floor with a flashlight, and swept under the toe kick with a yardstick until the rivet came out. I put it back in my shirt pocket. It has been there since. This past October, I did not sleep well. That is not a figure of speech, and it is not a wound I am carrying around for anybody to look at. Every year, from about the 3rd week of that month through the middle of November, I am awake at 2 and 3 in the morning, and I have been since 1979, and I was again this year, with a bridge open and a daughter safe. And every one of those people charged. It did not fix it. It was never going to fix it. There are some things you take out and replace, and there are some things that stay in the structure, and you learn which is which, and then you go on, carrying the load. In June, she came out to the garage, and I taught her to lay a horizontal bead on 1/4-inch plate. Her hand is steadier than mine is now. When she stopped to change the lens in her hood, I took the rivet out of my pocket, put it in her palm, and closed her fingers over it. She looked at it a long time. Then she put it in the chest pocket of her coveralls, pulled the hood down, struck an arc, and neither one of us said a word about it. For 42 years, I believed that if I controlled everything and paid for everything, nobody I loved would ever fall. I stood behind my daughter in the dark for 11 years checking her arithmetic, and I called it love. And it was fear wearing love's coat. Here is what I know now. You cannot protect anybody by carrying their weight for them. All you can do is teach them what a bad weld sounds like, and then step back and trust that they will hear it. Protection is not standing in front of your child. It is standing 8 feet behind her with your hands at your sides, while she says the true thing out loud. A signature can be forged. A seal can be copied. What cannot be counterfeited is a person who knows what she knows and will not be talked out of it. I am not a church-going man. My wife was. She used to say that God does not usually come in the whirlwind, that he comes in the ordinary hour in whoever shows up. I did not understand her for 30 years. I think I do now, and I thank God for it. Because when it came down to it, God sent me an old man with a cane who would not let go of my elbow. A stranger in a trailer who handed me his last good tool. And a truck driver who put his fist on a piece of steel and said, "That is not right." None of them owed me anything. Every one of them
came anyway. So let me ask you something. Be honest. Nobody is watching. He offered me a clean way out. Walk to your truck, and my daughter keeps her career and her future. Say nothing, and one bridge in 400 is somebody else's problem. If that had been your child standing there, and that hand was out in front of you, and only you would ever know, would you have taken it? Tell me in the comments. I mean it. Tell me what you would have done, and tell me about the time somebody looked at your hands and decided what you were worth. I read them all, and if this one stayed with you, stay with us.